Hello there. So today I'm going to be talking about gender diversity in instrumental Western classical music. In 2016, the Williams Institute of UCLA did a study that reported in the US there are around 1.4 million adults that identify as transgender. This same institute performed a separate study in 2020 that reported more than 1.2 million adults identify as non-binary. The non-binary study goes on to clarify that a majority of the individuals that identify as non-binary are not transgender. With this information, we can estimate that in the United States, there are roughly about 2 million adults identifying as non-binary or transgender. This study does not include any mention of other gender non-conforming identities. In 2014, the American League of Orchestras reported that an estimated 105,000 musicians performed in orchestras that year. With these statistics in mind, how many of those 105,000 musicians also make up the nearly 2 million gender nonconforming adults in the United States? This intersectionality is often overlooked by administrations of these organizations, which can so often result in the neglect of the needs of so many people who do not identify in the binary that has for so long been considered the norm. Through the use of firsthand experiences, statistics, and critical analysis, I will dissect the experiences of transgender and gender nonconforming people in American instrumental Western classical music, as well as critique the role the gender equity movement has played in these experiences. Throughout this project, I will be using terms that are common throughout the transgender community. For the sake of clarity, I will define some of these as they are defined by the GLAAD Media Reference Guide on how to accurately report on transgender people. The term transgender is often defined as an umbrella term to describe anyone whose gender identity is anything other than the sex they were assigned at birth. One of the most common misconceptions is that to be transgender is dependent on one's physical appearance or medical procedures, but is rather one of many identifiers gender non-conforming people can use to better represent who they are. Some other less generalized terms that I will be using in this project are non-binary or genderqueer, someone who identifies with their gender falling outside of the binary categories of either man or woman. Gender nonconforming, another term often used by individuals who feel their gender identity falls outside the conventional ideas of masculine and feminine. Cisgender, a person who is not transgender and identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth. Finally, gender identity. This may seem self-explanatory, but often for those outside the trans community is a tough concept to grasp. For those that do not identify with the sex they are assigned at birth, the process of finding the identity that they feel the most comfortable with is often a long and complex process. Ultimately, all these terms are different ways for those that do not fit in the binary system to feel comfortable being the person they are. In the past few years, the world is becoming more aware of the issues facing the trans community. Some of the most controversial subjects to come up are pronouns and clothing, two things that have historically been very gendered. The use of they them pronouns as a singular pronoun has been a particular point of contention within some communities. The use of they them pronouns is often adopted by non-binary people and other genderqueer people as a gender-neutral way of being referred to. For many trans people, using the binary pronouns of the sex they were assigned at birth can be a very dysphoric and invalidating experience. Along with the use of binary pronouns, the wearing of gendered clothes can also bring many trans people intense dysphoria regarding one's own gender. This can often play a direct role in the lives of instrumental musicians in Western classical music. In 2020, John Baer wrote an article in the publication Westword of one such instance in the Denver Philharmonic Orchestra. At the end of their summer season, a bassist in the orchestra, Zadie James Antonio, who identifies as non-binary and genderqueer, expressed the desire to wear a dress for their last performance of the season. While the request was granted, this request sparked a conversation within the orchestra that was much needed. Before this, the orchestra had a very traditional dress code requiring men to wear a black tuxedo or suit, white shirt, black bow tie, black socks, and black shoes. Women were required to wear a mid-calf to mid-ankle black skirt or sleeve dress, or long black slacks with a sleeved black blouse and black shoes. The result was a total reevaluation by the administration of their dress code requirements and how they affected the members of the orchestra. This incident took place at the end of the DPO's summer season, and by February of the following year, they made the announcement of their new policy. This included the removal of their previous gendered requirements and 3 new gender-neutral options available for anyone in the orchestra to choose. The options are a black tuxedo or suit, a black skirt or sleeve dress, or a black blouse and slacks. I think this was a very appropriate response to the issue at hand. Not only does this change give gender nonconforming and trans people the freedom to express themselves, but gives every member of the orchestra more leeway when it comes to how they dress in concerts. When I was working on my bachelor's degree at Millikan University, I had a very similar experience. When I was a senior, the director of bands retired and the university set out to hire someone new to head the program. The new hire was a younger person who had just finished his DMA. One of the first changes he made to our band program was a very similar change to our dress code. Previously, we had a very restrictive traditional dress code dictating what men and women are both to wear. But before our first concert, he started listing 3 neutral options that can be worn by anyone. This way, the group continues to look uniform while providing freedom for self-expression. I was not the only person who greatly appreciated these changes. I was so surprised at how many people took the opportunity to explore how they dressed in concerts. I knew that this change would create a more comfortable environment for those of us who identify outside of the binary, but I didn't expect so many of my classmates to challenge the norms that had been placed on them. Even some of the great American orchestras are incredibly resistant to these changes. It wasn't until 2018 that the New York Philharmonic Orchestra even allowed women to wear pants during their formal evening concerts. It can often be very difficult to advocate for the rights of genderqueer people when the classical music community has for so long struggled with the rights of cisgendered women. It can be difficult to have a conversation about gender equity in the American classical music industry without talking about the long history of struggles women have faced in the classical music setting. In an article in the Sociological Review, Anna Bull analyzes the power dynamic between conductors who identify as cisgendered males and their students. Her article is incredibly detailed and observes several different musical ensembles being rehearsed, but for my purposes, I will be drawing on some of her larger conclusions. The power struggles between genders take a look at the demanding nature of conductors on their students through a series of very intense mirroring, or demanding that students mimic your behaviors to achieve an end result that is desirable. She argues that this can be a useful teaching tool, but questions the consequences when you have male-identifying conductors asking female-identifying students to mirror a body that is not theirs. After these rehearsals, she interviews students about how they feel in rehearsals and their relationship with their conductor. More often than not, male students would equate their relationship with their male conductor as a bonding experience, while female students reported their relationship being similar to that of a dog that is trying to be obedient to its master. While it may seem that this binary study has little to do with my project on gender nonconforming people, I find it is actually a great example of how important representation is at such a young age. When students are learning music, so often they base their behaviors on achieving what is being asked of them and mimicking their instructors. In the past, music education has been dominated by a male-identifying majority. This majority can make it hard for anyone who does not identify in this way to feel that they have a place in the professional music community. To see significant change in the professional orchestral setting, the change needs to come from more representation in education of all levels. With these frustrations also comes the knowledge that progress is being made. With the internet being an incredible tool for communication and education, there are great resources available to anyone. One such resource is Classical Queer, founded by Canadian conductor and musicologist Jacob Edward Keynes. This website contains many resources regarding the gender nonconforming music community. While this website features primarily Canadian musicians, it is still a very useful tool in terms of educating about classical music of the trans community. On this website is an extensive database of genderqueer musicians, composers, administrators, and conductors. Along with the database are podcasts and interviews featuring queer musicians and artists. When doing the research for this project, one resource that I was continually seeing referenced is a study published in 2016 by the American League of Orchestras titled Racial, Ethnic, and Gender Diversity in the Orchestral Field. The study analyzed data between 1980 and 2014. In this 10-page analysis, there is not one mention of a transgendered or gender nonconforming person. In regard to gender, they simply compare the numbers of men and women in American orchestras. This is a very good example of a lot of the problems that the trans community is facing in this conversation. The lack of conversation altogether. For so long, trans people were not acknowledged enough to have a seat at the table, so to speak. It hasn't been until the last several years that the visibility of the trans community has become a topic of conversation that is slowly gaining prevalence. A lot of the difficulty I found when doing this research was the lack of information. There are so few studies done in regards to the experiences of gender nonconforming people in our field that it can almost feel like total erasure. But the more time that passes, the more I have heard and seen these conversations being had. Throughout my time at CCM, I have seen more and more programs featuring LGBTQ+ composers and BIPOC composers. It can often be frustrating that the research has not been done on so many of these topics, but it's up to us as performers, artists, and scholars to create those spaces to celebrate the people that have for so long been oppressed or considered the other. In 2021, visibility and awareness of the trans community grows every day. With the consciousness also comes the knowledge that the system as it is does not always benefit everyone that it affects. As the classical instrumental community moves forward, awareness of women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and BIPOC rights have to be at the forefront of every conversation being had about where our industry is headed. There are so many stories to be told through the vessel we get to be a part of, and creating an environment where individuals can be comfortable enough to tell them has to be our top priority. For effective change to take place, we must rely on musicians, scholars, and activists to continue to advocate for those who have been largely erased from the history of our field. So I wanted to play a quick little video that I found from the League of America's American Orchestras Conference in 2020. It was a Zoom conference, and it is titled Addressing Gender Equity on and Off the Stage. And I just wanted to play a little clip of Sheila Williams, who is actually one of the board members for the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, talking about gender equity and inclusion.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I want to make sure that we are being thorough in our conversation, and I'm highly conscious that a conversation around gender immediately then brings to mind the intersectionality of people that of our entire communities and individual identities as they think in terms of race, of other communities of color, of race, of ethnicity, of being non-binary or transgender. So as we think about this conversation and how it relates to the inclusion of other groups, how gender intersects with race and ethnicity, I want to be highly conscious of that because it is in fact a multidimensional conversation anytime we're talking about inclusion and equity. And I'm just wondering if you all have thoughts on inclusion at that level. Once we think about how do we include those that are maybe non-binary, that are transgender, how do we be acknowledging of someone's identity when it is, and all of us are, some level intersectional. How do we acknowledge all of those facets and dimensions that make up identity and continue on the road to inclusion and ultimately towards equity?
I think you start by saying at a high level in an organization, this is important, we need to do it. You won't get buy-in right away from everyone. A lot of people will be quietly saying, yes, we should, but maybe not feel strong enough to say it publicly. But it needs to be done. I think in this time, a lot has been illuminated across the board, and many of the boundaries have begun to dissolve. And I just feel that, we recognize that we are in a new environment. And because of that, the possibilities are endless, and for some, they're frightening. But this is the world we find ourselves in. So we either survive in it and make sure that the work that we do is appreciated and heard by many, or we don't.
Thank you so much for listening.